Let's now take a look at the importance of understanding opposing curves and directional flow. So in terms of directional flow, it really goes back to the things I've been saying about static shapes versus shapes that have directionality to them. And we can achieve that by kind of bending the edges and the sides of things to give a general directionality to the shape. Right, so this shape really, if you ask someone what direction it's moving in, it's not really moving in any particular direction. And you might say to someone, hey, what direction do you think this is moving? And they'll probably say it's moving in this particular direction. And the same applies to form, where we want to avoid using non-directional forms or forms that lack kind of energy. I'll draw through on this cube just for the sake of a better understanding. And this is very static. It's not really moving anywhere. Although you could definitely argue that this side, in terms of a shape, is a directional shape for sure, right? Directional shape's moving there, but the overall form is very static. And so what we want to do then as well is add directionality to the forms, kind of bending our forms in particular ways and having the form feel more directional, right? Like it has more energy to it. Things are being bent and twisted, and there's some kind of movement happening in the form. All right, so static shapes and forms we don't want, and dynamic shapes and forms we do want, right? And this applies both into our compositional thinking when we're thinking about shapes, and of course into our form thinking when we're thinking about forms, and the three-dimensionality of the things that we are creating and things that we are drawing. All right, but now adding on to this knowledge, right, so that we know dynamic is good, right? Dynamic is good, but how do we apply this dynamism to the human form? And this particular theory has different names, although I don't think it's ever been called the name that I tend to call it, or explained particularly in the way I'm going to explain it to you. But nevertheless, I like to think of this as opposing curves. Okay, opposing curves. And really the rule is that where one thing curves one way, the next thing will curve the next. And you've seen this when we've done our form-based, when we've done our, when we've done our forms, our dynamic forms, we will make the top of the arm bend one way, and then we'll bend the forearm another way. And really, another name for this is rhythm or flow is another name as well. And this is introducing this rhythm or flow or opposing curves, this directionality into a character or any kind of living object. And you can also obviously also put it into non-living objects as well, but specifically in terms of characters, we want to think about this in terms of the form and in terms of the anatomy. And so opposing curves theory really is that we don't ever want to have, first of all, some curves that kind of repeat like this, because then there's kind of there's really no energy flow through this. It's kind of stops here, and then the energy just has to then start again, and it's like a pause in the energy flow. So it's kind of like boom, pause, and then it has to start again, boom, and it loses its flow, right? And you can see the difference when we have something like this. The energy just kind of keeps going, right, when we have opposing curves happening. In addition, when we're doing opposing curves, we want to make sure that the curves don't ever oppose in a parallel way. So for example, here I have two paralleling curves. All right, and yes, they're certainly in opposing curves fashion, but hopefully you can see that the fact that the lines are parallel means that the shapes are no longer dynamic, and so that there is no directionality in the shapes, even though we're using opposing curves theory. And so really what we want to do is we want to take dynamic shape and form theory and add it to opposing curves theory, and therefore get ourselves a great system for drawing natural looking forms, natural looking gestures, natural looking characters that look alive, that look like they're filled with energy, that look like they're just paused in time. But usually when we're not pausing them in a single image, they're walking around and they're thinking and they're talking and they're living their lives, right? So opposing curves theory, once again, really is just that something curves the one way, you then curve it another way. And you may be saying, hey, I've heard of something called straight to curve, or I've heard of something like curve against straight. And that is in fact a different theory that isn't got to do with gesture, has got to do more with avoiding parallels or creating basically non-parallel shapes, which we will talk about later in the course. So don't worry about that for now. Opposing curves, really, if something curves one way, the next piece of it should curve the other way. Now, when we get to bringing these theories, right, into character drawing, I've got a stock photo here of a little baseball player, and we're going to draw over him so that you can kind of see how these opposing curves work, as well as how the dynamic shape works, both in the shape of his gesture and the forms of his gesture. Okay, so let's get right into it. And first of all, we can just start by defining his head, because that's always a great starting point with characters. Just get the head shape in there. And we want to consider the back of the head as one of our first curves, right? So it's curving that way. That means we can't see his neck here, but that would mean that his neck would then have to curve the other way, right? So it does that. And then we come into his back shape. And so we will imagine his whole torso, and I'm keeping it 2D for now, bending that way, which would mean that as we come through his stomach and down into his pelvis, right, so we've curved this way. Let's actually do that in blue. The shape, the dynamic shape, will then naturally kind of curve the opposite direction. Right? So we can see this happening here. That curves down, and then this curves inwards. Similarly on the front, it curves down, and then this one curves outwards. All right. And then we get to the legs, and they are their whole own shapes. So you kind of, I know it can be confusing when you're trying to think about it in terms of the pelvis. They really are their own shapes. The front of the leg would curve down like this. So that curves in that direction. And then the back of the leg would have to oppose. So it would make a dynamic shape in that direction. Right. And similarly for the other leg. It curves like that. And then this one curves in the opposite way. You can see as well that I'm not sticking exactly to the anatomy here. And that's a very key point, especially when we go and actually do our practical gesture drawing demos and exercises, that we are not trying to capture the anatomy here, right? When we're talking about gesture, until we get to anatomical gestures, when we're talking about the kind of the core, the soul of gesture, we're just trying to capture the core, right? The core directional forces moving through the form and trying to grasp them so that when we're left with just the gesture, we can still tell what's going on, even though there's no detailing or anatomy or anything. We can say, okay, this kid is running, or this person is running, or what have you. Let's do the arms. The arms work in a similar way. And just as a side note, the way I tend to figure out the arms, even when I'm drawing, is I draw the forearm's directionality first. So here I would say this forearm is doing that. It has that kind of directional shape. And this back one's kind of hard to read, but I would say it's doing that. And because I know the direction of the one curve, so this guy's curving that way, right? I know that the next curve going into the rear arm needs to be an opposing curve. So I can't ever have curve and then say, oh, well, there's my arm shape. That would be weird, and it wouldn't make sense in terms of the directionality. Because we know opposing curve says needs to oppose, so the correct shape would be this and then that, and it looks way more correct. So here we then take the curve the opposite direction and draw in that directional shape. All right. And then similarly here, if it's curving that way there, then it's curving this way here. All right. And so we can then see the curves oppose. This would then curve that way, that shape curves over there, and then the opposing curve comes down on the other side. Let's take the reference image away, and you can see we got a good feeling. We haven't copied anatomy, we haven't thought too crazy about forms and details and so on and so forth. We're just thinking about the gesture and the gestural shapes. This is the first key and most important foundational thing that we need to be aware of when we are trying to learn to do gesture drawings. So we want to capture the opposing curves in the gestures. And when we fully understand this, right, and you will do many exercises to get it into your system, then we can start adding on top of this. And by no means, let me just add, by no means is this a particular drawing workflow. It may be a workflow for you, but as we know from Module 3, we want to do shape and form at the same time. So we want to really draw forms and then modify the forms based on our shape theory. But if you wish to work in this in a workflow type of way where you say to yourself, okay, I want to do shape gestures first, we're just using directional shapes, then I want to build forms on top, then I want to put details on top of the forms, you can do that as well if it's better for you to understand that. Nevertheless, when we understand this in terms of gesture studies, we want to grasp this first, grasp the 2D first, right? Or the 2D or the directional flow shapes, right? Let's call them DF shapes. And then we want to move on to adding directional flow forms or dynamic forms. So I'm really using these terms interchangeably. Move into 3D directional forms, dynamic forms, right? So we can then come here to what we've done here and then start imagining those cylinders that we want to have going to help us define the forms and help us really grasp drawing in 3D, and then use what we know of the shapes, the basic shapes that we've been learning, the basic forms, mind you, we've been learning for these elements, the pelvis and the chest and so on and so forth, to really get these forms in there, right, and putting in our center lines and so on. And you can see here where I'm just really adding those forms over the dynamic shapes, and it's giving me a great sense of motion and movement and life. Something that, apart from utilizing these theories and having this understanding, I wouldn't be able to do. I wouldn't be able to draw this because my brain, and generally speaking, most beginner brains, in terms of art, thinks, hey, let me draw anatomy, right? Let me draw anatomy. But characters are so much more than anatomy. And we really want to grasp that and move past that so that we can really become experts at understanding how people move and how people move based on how they feel and how they're and who they are as people and so on. But we'll get into this deeper stuff later. Nevertheless, what we want to understand really, I'm going to just reiterate again, so we want to have our directional shapes. We want to make sure the shapes and forms that we use are directional. And then we want to say to ourselves, okay, in forms, particularly characters, in the instance of this course, in characters, we want to make sure that the curves oppose, or the dynamic shapes curves oppose each other, right? So we have an opposing curve. So the curve's that way, it curves out, and the next one will then curve in. And as an addition, and I had mentioned this in Module 3, we want to realize that this happens even as we go onto a micro level. So it happens on the hand. So if we were just doing a basic hand shape here for his hand out here, I'm just going to draw in a hand that's, I'm just going to add my own hand in here. If the curve is going out like that, that means the palm of the hand would then come out like that, and then the fingers would oppose like that, right? In a macro sense, if we just divided the hand into two separate elements, we'd have this part curving up like that, and then the fingers curving down, because we still want to have the opposing curves theory in there, because it just makes sense and it works and it's wonderful. And then similarly, you can go even more macro. So here we have the palm and the fingers, but if we zoom in on the actual fingers, and I think that we did cover this in Module 3, the fingers themselves and their joints will be made up of opposing curve shapes, where we have, one piece and then the joint, and then another piece and then the joint, and then another piece that would be the tip, right? The finger, because the fingers have 3 joints. And the directional flow through the fingers opposes, right? And you will notice immediately when you start implementing this theory into your work that immediately your characters will start seeming more natural, more loose, more professional. No matter what level you're at, when you apply it, suddenly something seems more informed about your work, more natural, and things start seeming more alive. And that's exactly how I want to, or where I want to take you guys, get us to that point. So here I'm just going to kind of do a quick detailing as if I were drawing an actual finger over here, and you can see it's a living type of finger, right? Even with very basic anatomy there, it's living because of this directional flow shapes, and using the opposing where we want to oppose each of the curves. All right, I'm sure that that's solidified. Let's move on to the next lesson.